The ram hits the wall. A dull thud. Iron on stone. It echoes through the city. Again. And again. Slow. Relentless. Cries go up in the city walls. They know what it means. What this sound means. Once that wall breaks, it's all over. Again, the thud. And then, one man moves. He runs across the wall, under a storm of arrows. He reaches the edge, and lifting up a huge rock, hurls it down, smashing the head clean off. The sound stops. The thuds stop. Silence. And then, the man jumps down, outside the wall, into the midst of the Roman army, into the siege works itself. He lifts up the broken iron head, and he carries it back, up the wall. Arrows flying at him. He makes it back to the top. This is a glimpse of what's to come. A war that won't be just decided in a single day, or even in a single battle, but a war fought street by street, stone by stone, where small victories like this one, won by brave individuals, will shape the course of each day, where the courage of a handful of men will defy the greatest military machine on earth, and a war where even that machine, for all its numbers, for all its power, for all its engines of war, will come to rely on its own chosen men. Because in the smoke, in the chaos of the city fighting, numbers will become meaningless, and this war will be won or lost, based off the actions of just a few. Welcome to History's Darkest Hours with me, Sean James. This is part 2 of a 3-part series, Ashes of Zion, the story of the Great Jewish Revolt. If you haven't listened to episode 1, then I'd recommend you start there to get the full picture. Otherwise, let's begin. You'll recall from our last episode that Cestius Gallus, the governor of Syria, suffered a humiliating defeat in the hills of Judea at the hands of a bunch of Jewish rebels. And Cestius had an army of 25,000, a full Roman legion with support. Humiliated. Well, he barely makes it out alive, and he seems to have died shortly after. Now, ancient sources suggest that it was either from natural causes, or it's also been described as vexation, which basically means humiliation and stress may have just finished him off. And strangely enough, after helping ignite the rebellion, our antagonist, Florus, the procurator, well, little more is written about Florus. He seems to disappear off the face of the earth, and our villain exits the story. But the man who's now taken over command of the Roman response, he's somebody that history will remember very well, Vespasian. Because the events of this war and the empire itself are about to make Vespasian one of the most famous men in the Roman world. At this point, however, he's just simply a Roman general. He's also been a provincial governor in North Africa, a capable soldier, but not yet a great figure in the Roman world. When Vespasian arrived in Syria, he would have been in his late 50s, already a veteran of campaigns in Britannia, Germania, and an accomplished governor. And only called back into service, really, because of this Jewish revolt. If this hadn't happened, he probably would have faded into obscurity, into retirement. His family, the Flavians, they were relatively new to this level of society. Their background was respectable, but hardly aristocratic. He didn't come from one of Rome's great noble families. His grandfather was a tax collector, and his unremarkable background is likely what made him more attractive to Nero. Because the emperor, you see, he was deeply suspicious of ambitious generals. And Vespasian, for all his talent, he wasn't seen as a political threat. And so Nero entrusts him with this enormous responsibility, restoring Roman authority in Judea. And Vespasian, he also brings with him his eldest son, Titus, a decision that will prove enormously important for the story that follows. Several months after the defeat of Cestius, Vespasian arrives in Syria and begins assembling his forces, where he finds King Agrippa and other client kings, including the King of Arabia, waiting for him with their troops. Vespasian, he has 2 legions, and they meet up with Titus, who's just marched from Alexandria in Egypt with another legion, giving Vespasian a total of 3 legions, plus auxiliaries, client troops. He could have most likely had in the range of somewhere up to 60,000 men under his command, but perhaps only a third of these being legionnaires, the rest of them being auxiliaries, archers, slingers, cavalry, and so forth, and the troops from the client kings. But despite all the auxiliary troops and the client armies, don't get me wrong, this is a serious army. This is Rome now wanted to do business. And in this several months, for the Jews, what have they been up to? Well, they've been ripe off this victory over Rome. Many of them must have felt ecstatic. And you can imagine the adrenaline, the confidence, even the arrogance of some of these rebels after defeating a Roman army. Josephus describes how war parties attacked nearby garrison cities. But the Jewish rebels, their winning streak wouldn't last very long. A group of rebels rushed off and attacked a Roman-held city, Ascalon. And at that city, the Roman cavalry rode out and rode them down on the plains outside the city. Like a total massacre. After regrouping and returning with reinforcements for round 2, they're soundly beaten again, losing thousands. So their military actions are not very successful, but they do occupy most of Judea, apart from these few Roman garrisons at select cities. But you have to understand, after they threw off the Romans, there was still this big power vacuum in Jerusalem. You still had the moderates, those that wanted to work with Rome, so they wanted to come to some sort of negotiated peace. And then you had the various groups of rebels. So you had the Zealots, the Sicarii. Now these were more of the violent, the more hardcore amongst the rebel groups, possibly. You had others that were a little more moderate, but their aims were the same. They wanted to make war with Rome and to have their own land. And what was evident early on was that all these different parties, these leaders, they wouldn't agree on much. Some effort was made to put structure in place. For example, there were commanders and governors. They were selected to run and defend the various districts, including our friend Josephus, who was charged with control of Galilee, for example. Now, he talks extensively of building and repairing walls of various cities, training soldiers and citizens to fight for what he sees as the inevitable Roman retaliation. And when you read Josephus' writings, it does seem that solid efforts were made to defend the country, but perhaps haphazardly. Given the fractured government, it's hard to really say how prepared the Jews were, given that Josephus is our main account, one of our only accounts actually. And as you learn later in this episode, Josephus, he may be prone to exaggerating just a little. But what we do know is in Jerusalem, another priest, Ananus, he emerges as a very influential leader at this time. Not to be confused with the zealot leader, Eleazar ben Ananias, whose father Ananias was also a high priest and he was killed during the uprising. Now this Ananus, along with other senior priests and influential men, Well, they try their best to prepare a defence to run the country and basically set up a provisional government of sorts. So they're trying to avoid chaos, to avoid breakdown of law and order, which, as it turns out, would be far easier said than done. So this is the situation we find ourselves. Vespasian arrives in Syria. He's collected his legions, his troops, and Judea, they've made some preparation at least, possibly a lot more, to prepare for the coming onslaught. And off the back of this, Vespasian doesn't waste any time getting to business. So in Roman Judea, Jerusalem is located further south, and to the north you have an area called Galilee, which is the area where Vespasian starts the Roman fight back. He doesn't just go burning the countryside, by the way. He's asking cities to open the doors to him. Hey, come and join our side. Give him a chance to say sorry. Hey, sorry we were pressured into it. That sort of thing. Josephus, he writes the following of Vespasian. He showed his army to the enemy in order to affright them, and to afford them a season for repentance, to see whether they would change their minds before it came to battle. And at the same time, he got things ready for besieging their strongholds. And indeed, this sight of the general and his army brought many to repent of their revolt. So, he's a clever guy. You can see that already. But any cities that do resist, he starts the siege, usually ending very quickly, before moving on. He's also very efficient. He splits his forces into smaller groups, each taking multiple settlements at the same time. So he's not marching around town to town. He's getting a move on. But on the flip side, there's also a lot of burning and pillaging happening now. The atrocities start again. Roman auxiliary forces based in Sepphoris begin sweeping through the Galilean countryside, burning villages, seizing livestock, enslaving the population. And within weeks, a lot of the region's already been ravaged. A Roman commander named Placidus attempts a quick strike against a fortress city called Jotapata. But the defenders were ready. They sally out of the gates and they drive the Romans off, forcing Placidus to withdraw quickly. Well, soon after this, the real invasion begins. Vespasian marches with the full Roman army and advances into Galilee. So when word spreads that the legions are approaching, panic spreads very quickly through the rebel forces. You've got to consider that many of these men were only recently trained under Josephus. They're not soldiers, they're just ordinary civilians that have been trained in a couple of sessions perhaps. Now these abandon their positions and flee before the Romans even appear. Now Josephus himself, he eventually withdraws to the city of Jotapata that we spoke of, the fortress city. And this is one of the best defended fortresses in the entire area, which is why he makes his stand there. Now, Josephus, he seems to lose his bottle quite early on. Though, to be fair, he's in a province that's currently being attacked, and he's got 60,000, of the Roman army in the province. And he can witness what's happening, what he's up against. But whether out of fright or pure logic, he seems to have given up pretty early on. Now, he sends a message to Jerusalem asking for instructions. Like, hey, shall we come to terms? What's the plan? Maybe we've bitten off a bit more than we can chew. Now, this Roman army is really big. It's bigger than the last one. They fight really well. This sort of thing. And he adds at the end, if you aren't willing to consider asking for terms, then please send us some troops. Send me some troops to help. No help is sent. Vespasian, he brings almost his entire army to Jotapata. And though he doesn't realise it yet, this isn't going to be a walkover. So this city is walled, but on three sides there's sheer cliffs, basically. It's unapproachable, leaving only one side, one front to attack. So quite a defensible position. As the attacker, you can only bring your full army to bear on the one side, which renders the majority of his army a little useless, yeah? And consider his campaign so far, as short as it's basically been a mop-up operation. He's going from one city to the next. Often they're surrendering. But yeah, the defenders, they have a natural defence. But it's a double-edged sword as well, because for the defenders, well, they can't escape the city. They've got the steep valleys on the three sides. The only way out is through the front, which is where an entire Roman army is now camped. So the defenders are literally trapped. Yeah, you get the feeling that Vespasian was expecting a quick victory here, but what comes next is almost a daily grind of attrition, and this is where the real ugly fighting starts. So on the first day, Josephus, he describes how Vespasian sends his archers and his slingers. So a lot of these would be from his auxiliary troops and perhaps the client armies, the client king's troops. So a sizable force, and these are expert slingers, expert archers, Arabian archers, for example. Well, Josephus, from inside the city, he rushes out and sallies with his Jewish troops and charges them outside the city, bringing many deaths and wounded to both sides. But this is a reoccurring theme. Over the next several days, they repeatedly do this, keep charging out of the gates from behind their walls and attacking the Romans. And encouraged by their early success, the rebels are fighting very fiercely, while the Romans, who are embarrassed that the city hasn't already fallen, well, with equal measure, they are determined to resist the onslaught of the Jewish sallies. Now, Titus and a lot of these, especially the legionnaires, well, these are different legionnaires, mostly, and they haven't had a proper battle with the Jewish forces yet, so they're taken aback. They're pretty shocked. You know, this is supposed to be the mop-up operation, right? And then they get to Jerusalem, and that's where they have they'll have the siege and the final battle, but here they are in Galilee, in the first province, and they're facing really stiff resistance. So Vespasian, yeah, he's had a setback. The defenders are putting up a tougher fight than he expected, but adapt and overcome. He's an experienced general, and he collectively gets his officers together in the tent. They have a war meeting, council, and he's like, yeah, right, around the table, what can we do? What ideas? Well, they decide to build a bank. Basically a giant ramp that edges up against the walls of the city. This is going to take time. He sends his army out. They have to cut down lots of trees for wood, collect rocks, that sort of thing. Materials needed to build this huge ramp. And once they have all the materials together, they start building. But they have to protect themselves from the city walls, so they build these big shields to protect the workers from the slings, from the rocks, the arrows. But Vespasian, he's got a few more tools up his sleeve. Something Josephus doesn't have, by the way. He's got the ancient equivalent of modern-day artillery. Siege engines. Josephus claims 160 in total. So these are the ballistae, throw huge arrows, or more like spears, catapults that lob huge stones. The Arabian archers that we talked about, slingers, and they start to rain down fire on the wall constantly. So much that the Jews can't even occupy the top of the wall most of the time, not without heavy casualties. So can you imagine all these siege engines, 160 archers, slingers, all focusing on this one wall, just raining down a constant storm of missiles? Yeah, so that's what the defenders are up against. But the Jews, you know, they keep taking these opportunities to sally out onto the Romans again, occasionally attacking the works on the ramp, tearing down the shields, taking whatever they could, burning, all the while taking lots of casualties themselves in doing this. But they're trying their best. But as the Roman siege ramp creeps closer and closer to the walls, Josephus realises the city will soon be overrun if it carries on like this. Now, what comes next is honestly ingenious. So Josephus orders the citizens to start building the walls higher. And I know it sounds mad. There's an obvious problem. You've got all the ancient artillery, the arrows, the catapults, the ballista. How do you even attempt to build the wall higher with this constant rain of death? Well, he has his men take fresh ox skins, and they stretch these skins over these wooden frames to make their own giant shields to protect the builders. Flexible shields, by the way, that they actually, partially at least, absorb the force of the catapult stones. Now, under this protection, the defenders are working night and day, raising the walls. And you can imagine the frustration of the Romans when they realise what's happening, you know? I mean, they believe they're almost on the verge of storming the city. A couple more days, we've got the ramp up to the wall where we need it. And suddenly, the wall's getting higher. Picture the geometry of the situation. The Romans are building this slope ramp, right? At a small incline. For every metre that wall gets higher, now that ramp needs to be built exponentially bigger and longer. And critically, they need more materials and more time. So Vespasian, at this point, he's clearly getting annoyed. And to rub salt in the wound, the Jewish forces, they make a fresh round of sallies at the Roman troops. And Vespasian, basically, he instructs his army, pull back, don't engage, just hold the lines, we're going to starve them out. He's had enough. Now, the reason why these events shocked me the most is because Josephus, the man who's telling the story, by the way, he doesn't appear to have come from any real military background. He's just the son of an aristocratic family. He's more of a scholar and a writer than a warrior. He did a trip to Rome, but in Jerusalem, before the war, there's no record of his military training that I found. Yet, if you take his account at face value, the defenders are putting up a surprisingly good resistance. Now, we need to take his words with a pinch of salt, but whether it is ideas or other fighters within the city, it's still remarkable that they held the Romans off the way they did. Because Rome, at this time, it's the superpower of this area of the world. It's like the ancient equivalent to, say, the US military of today. And yet, here they are, facing what Rome must consider to be a provincial revolt or a third-rate power. And they're being embarrassed again, and taking quite serious losses as well. Enough so that Vespasian, one of Rome's most capable generals, now telling his troops to stop attacking, to pull back. Oh, let's dig in, wait them out. Again, to use the modern-day comparison, this should be something like Operation Desert Storm, with the best-trained army, with all the high-tech equipment, walking over the opposition. Instead, it's turning into something quite different. Now, for the defenders, the food actually isn't the main concern. Unfortunately for them, they have a far worse problem, water, or rather, the lack of it. And the Romans seem to suspect this too. The city didn't have much of a water supply. As you'd imagine, it's got cliffs around the side of it. And coupled with the fact that they've got tens of thousands of extra mouths, well, they're going to run out of water very quickly. So Josephus, he introduces water rationing. It makes sense, logical. But then he also does something else. Again, something showing some real ingenuity. Quite ballsy, to be honest. In a desperate and bold move, in what can best be described as a gamble in psychological warfare, he has the citizens wash their clothes, and then take them up and leave them hanging over the side of the walls, in full view of the Roman army. Right? So you can imagine, like, the scene unfolding on the Roman side. Now, you're a Roman, a legionary, stood guard in the heat, probably a little thirsty yourself, and looking up at the city that you're trying to starve and thirst into submission, and suddenly laundry, water running down the battlements, where you can almost hear a pin drop when you picture a Roman officer walking into Vespasian's tent and whispering something like, General, you really need to come and see this. And he walks outside, and there the defenders are splashing water around like it's a car wash, you know. Now, wherever Josephus's intentions were, the water trick got a reaction, But maybe it wasn't the reaction that Josephus wanted. Maybe he was hoping that the Romans would march off and leave the city. Just walk around it and continue on. So Vespasian, he doesn't call off the siege, but rather he renews his attack. And you have to wonder, from Vespasian's side, was he actually fooled by this trick? My guess is that even if he suspected it was a trick, he couldn't risk waiting to find out. Because he wasn't there to sit outside one stubborn city forever, or just to continue and leave them. He was there to crush a rebellion, to subdue the entire province. So he had to take this city before moving on. At this point, Josephus realises that the Romans aren't going anywhere, and by his own account, he openly talks about trying to escape, slipping out of the city with a small group of men. Now, this is the beginning of a common theme. We've already seen that his art's not entirely in this war, but when you read his version of events, he starts to take a very defensive tone when he talks of himself. To me, it almost reads like something straight out of a Monty Python film. If you picture Josephus, his character being played by Graham Chapman or John Cleese, and the scene, it unfolds something like this. So the citizens discover that he's about to leave, and they confront him. And then Josephus defends himself, and he says something along the lines like, No, you calm down. I'm not trying to save myself, you know. I'm only going out for your own good. He claims the crowds, they gather around him, the women, the elderly, the children, they're all crying, grabbing at him, clutching at his feet, begging him not to abandon them. And Josephus is replying like, Look, if I stay here, I'm only going to get killed along with the rest of you. I'm much more valuable. If I leave, I'll definitely come back. I promise I'll come back with help. Anyway, as it happens, Josephus doesn't leave the city, but he goes at great lengths in his writings explaining himself. There's also a revealing moment in Josephus' account about Vespasian's character as a commander. At one point during the fighting, Vespasian, he gets a bit carried away, he gets close to the walls, and he actually gets struck himself by the slingers, and he injures his foot. He's not mortally wounded or anything. But for a moment, the soldiers are in panic, thought their general might have been seriously wounded. And this event, it actually does something interesting. It spurs them on, it encourages them. That the fact that their generals come into harm's way, it makes them fight harder. That's a tiny detail, but it also reveals something about Roman generals. I guess a lot of ancient warfare, actually. But Roman generals, they didn't just lead from miles away behind the lines. They were often physically present near the fighting, sometimes even coming dangerously close to it. Often in cases, especially in the later years, you get emperors leading the armies too. Anyway, Vespasian wasn't just standing safely in the rear. He's close enough to the walls that he was in harm's way. So the Romans, well, they resume building their ramp, all the while throwing stones, arrows, javelins, catapults, and the defenders are doing likewise where they can, shooting back. But for the Jewish defenders, despite the Oxides, they're still taking very heavy losses. And Josephus, as his men, take turns, basically rotating out in groups to man the walls because it's so deadly. Occasionally sallying out, attacking the Romans, but slowly but surely, the Roman war machine is creeping up onto the city. And the Roman battering ram starts knocking at the city walls. Josephus describes, Now at the very first stroke of this engine, the wall was shaken, and a terrible clamour was raised by the people within the city, as if they were already taken. You can hear the loud thud of this iron ram on the stone, only imagining the fear of those in the city when they could hear it. Like a clock, counting down to their demise, but a strong iron on stone thud, constant, not stopping. But something remarkable happens. Josephus tells us of a man named Eleazar, son of Samius. He goes on to say, This man took up a stone of vast bigness and threw it down from the wall upon the ram, and this with so great a force that it broke off the head of the ram, he also leapt down, and took up the head of the ram from the midst of them, and without any concern carried it back to the top of the wall. Josephus describes how, on climbing, he was shot with arrows 5 times, but still managed to make it back to the top before succumbing to his wounds. Now, the men defending the city, their courage was so stoked by the deeds of this one brave man that Josephus and the defenders, they make another one of these sallies. Only this time they really go to town, they give it to the Romans, they give them a good fight, and they manage to burn and disrupt the siege engines. But despite these brave acts, they can't stop the Roman war machine, and by nightfall, the Romans have erected the battering ram again, and they carry on, all the while arrows and siege engines firing missiles into the city. And Josephus describes the power of these terrifying machines very vividly, I'll warn. It's not for the faint-hearted. And so what was thrown at them was hard to be avoided, for the force with which these engines threw stones and darts made them hurt several at a time. And the violent noise of the stones that were cast by these engines was so great that they carried away the pinnacles of the wall, and broke off the corners of the towers. For no body of men could be so strong as to not be overthrown, to the last rank by the largeness of these stones. And anyone may learn of the force of these engines by what happened this very night. For as one of those that stood around close to Josephus was near the wall, his head was carried away by such a stone, and his skull was flung as far as 3 furlongs. 3 furlongs is about 600 metres, by the way. Perhaps a little exaggerated, but Josephus is making a point here. These machines were deadly. In another passage, he describes how a pregnant woman who just stepped outside of her house was struck by a stone from one of these catapults, and that the impact was so violent that her unborn child was found hurled from her body. It's horrific detail, I know, but it reminds us of something important here. For all we dissect on the military aspects of this story, that the biggest victims of war are often the normal citizens, the bystanders, who've had no part and no fault in the fighting that's taking place. And this is especially the case with city sieges, unfortunately. And Josephus, he's very detailed. He continues to describe the noises of the city, the whistling of arrows, the crash of the stones, the sounds of bodies being flung up against walls after they've been hit, and the screams of the women in the city and the children. A city with streets now streaming in blood, where the dead are starting to pile up. Next, Vespasian has his troops assault the city. Full trumpets sounding, in Roman fashion, their shields locked, sometimes overhead, and the Romans force their way up onto the walls. The defenders, exhausted and badly outnumbered now, a lot of them have died, while they resort to a brutal countermeasure of their own, boiling oil. The defenders pour it onto the attackers, who throw themselves off the walls and the ramps, rolling around on the ground, retreating, the assault collapsing. Josephus describes, "For the oil did easily run down the whole body from head to foot, under their entire armour, and fed upon their flesh like flame itself. And as the men were cooped up in their headpieces and breastplates, they could not get away from it, nor get free from this burning oil. They could only leap around and roll about in their pains." At this point, the siege has been underway for about 5 weeks, and as the fighting dragged on, Vespasian pulls his battered troops back for the evening. The assault has been costly, but the Roman army was far from discouraged. If anything, the setback has only hardened their resolve. And the next day, Vespasian escalates the siege. The Roman engineers who've been building the ramp, they keep raising it higher, and they now start to erect 3 massive siege towers on it, each nearly 50 feet tall, plated with iron to prevent them being burned by the defenders. And from these towers, the archers, slingers, even small artillery pieces, the crew could actually fire down directly onto the defenders, who now found it all but impossible to stand on top of these walls. Day after day, The bombardment continues. The people of Jotapata, they keep fighting stubbornly. But the Roman war machine is relentless. And this is one of those moments where you begin to see the strength of the Roman military. Because for the defenders of Jotapata, they've put up a remarkable defence. They've been brave, inventive, determined, against the worst possible odds, but it's not enough. Because the Roman army doesn't need to win quickly. This is their bread and butter. They can simply keep building, inching closer to the walls, taking 1 inch at a time, bringing up more siege equipment, raising the ramps higher and higher. And the Romans have a super weapon. They have logistics. Now, when I was younger, reading history and hearing about logistical sides of battles, I've always found it quite boring. Supply lines, transport, provisions. But the longer you study history, you realise the importance. It actually wins wars. Ask Napoleon or Wehrmacht Germany when they invaded Russia and the Soviet Union. On a massive scale, those wars were battles of supply and endurance. But back to Judea, even on a much smaller scale, the same principles apply. If you have an army operating in a dry, arid country like this, trying to besiege a city for weeks on end, you need food, you need water, tools, animals, engineers, a constant supply. If those supplies fail to arrive, then it's very likely that the siege will fail. And less organised armies may well have failed and abandoned the siege and simply moved on. But this isn't any normal army, this is the Roman military. And as the historian Adrian Goldsworthy writes in The Complete Roman Army, the Roman army's real strength lay not in superior courage, but in organisation, discipline, and the ability to sustain operations for long periods. You could make the argument that fighting the Romans in a war of attrition, such as a siege, the battle may have already been lost before it had even begun. Meanwhile, while Vespasian and his troops are trying to battle their way into the city, he lets some of his other forces go and carry on, attacking nearby cities, capturing other places in Galilee, including a city called Jaffa. And the result was catastrophic for the defenders of Jaffa. In the chaos of the battle, many of the fleeing defenders found themselves trapped between the city's outer wall and the inner wall. So the Romans, they'd seized the outer wall and closed the gates, while the citizens inside the inner wall, well, they closed the gates to the second wall. And you had all these defenders trapped in the middle, in panic. Thousands of them are slaughtered in this narrow space between the walls. Or you can imagine the Roman forces all tightly packed together with their shields, just forcing them ever closer and closer, more tightly, and slaughtering them. And when Titus arrives with some reinforcements, the Romans storm the inner city. And after brutal fighting in the streets, followed the mass slaughter of most of the population. 15,000 dead, and thousands carried off as slaves. And similar events unfold across Galilee. And the siege of Jotapata continues. Back there, the banks have been raised higher. And after weeks of fighting, the Romans finally learn something crucial from a Jewish deserter. So this deserter, he goes over to the Romans and he claims that the guards are standing vigilant watch throughout the night, but just before dawn, they're so exhausted that a lot of these guards, these defenders, well, they mostly fall asleep. Now this was the moment that Vespasian had been waiting for. So he prepares a small assault force. Quietly this time, no trumpets, no battle cries. And on this morning, it just so happens that a heavy mist descends on the city. And just a handful of men, chosen soldiers, start climbing up the ramp in the morning. Among them, Vespasian's own son, Titus. And Josephus tells us that Titus himself was first up upon the wall. And the deserter was right. The guards had been sleeping. And the Roman soldiers moved silently along the walls, cutting the throats of the watchmen, one by one. And the Romans are in the city, the army pouring over the walls. On the 47th day of the siege, the city is taken in one morning. Now, Josephus describes how most of the occupants were unaware of what happened until they woke, and they had this heavy mist that descended on the city, and what follows is a massacre. Some are waking in their beds to have their throats cut where they lay. Others managed to run into the streets where they cut down there, Josephus writes. And for the Romans, they were so well remembered what they had suffered during the siege that they spared none, nor pitied any, but drove the people down the precipice from the citadel and slew them as they drove them down. And the killing, it doesn't stop when the city's taken. You have people hiding underground, in tunnels, cellars, and for days the Romans are searching the ruins, dragging people from these hiding places, either to kill them or to enslave them. Josephus continues, "And they went thus through every age, excepting the infants and the women. And of these they were gathered together as captives 1,200. And as of those that were slain at the taking of the city, and in the former fights, well, they numbered to be 40,000. 40,000. Again, one thing to remember with ancient sources, even medieval sources, when it comes to casualties, battles, the numbers are often overly inflated, sometimes manyfold. Nonetheless, it was a huge slaughter that day. And the fortress of Jotapata, which had stubbornly held out against Vespasian and his legions, was now no more. But one man, the man who tells us this story, he's not among the dead. Unfortunately for Josephus, or perhaps very fortunately as it will turn out, the Romans know this too, and they're looking for him. Now, this is another one of those moments which make me wonder about Josephus. So it just so happens that during the chaos of the sacking, while the defenders and the residents are butchered, and many even more commit suicide, Josephus, he finds himself jumping down into this deep pit with a hidden cave beneath the city. And inside he finds, by his words, 40 other survivors in the same predicament, and they have some provisions, enough to last a few days. And they stay there concealed. But later, a woman from among them, she goes out, she's captured, and she gives up their location. The Romans, learning the location, and that Josephus is amongst them, they send messengers from Vespasian, offering to guarantee Josephus' safety if he surrenders. And Josephus, as it turns out, well, he's quite open to the idea. But the other men in the cave, not so much. Now bear in mind, many of these men had just watched the city get destroyed. For a lot of them, maybe this was their city and they might have just watched their families get slaughtered. And many of their fallen comrades have chosen to die over surrender. And they basically say, what are you doing? What do you mean? Why are you talking about surrendering? You're dying with us. And Josephus is like, he's trying to calm them down, and he's like, hey, don't be so hasty. Why are we all so eager to kill ourselves? And by his own account, he launches into a long philosophical speech explaining why suicide isn't so good after all. Anyway, these men, they aren't convinced. They call him a coward, and they threaten to kill him there and then. If he doesn't join them, they'll kill him themselves. Or Josephus, ever resourceful, he proposes a compromise. Or as he describes it, he puts his life into the hands of God. He tells the group, and I quote, "Since it is resolved among you that we will die, come on then, let us commit to our mutual deaths to determination by lot. He whom draws the first lot, let him be killed by him who has the second lot. And thus fortune shall make its progress through all of us. The second by the third, and so on, until they're all dead, basically." Bizarrely, these people who were about to kill Josephus, they all agree to this, maybe not knowing Josephus as we do. I'm sure we can all guess already what happens next. So they draw the lots, kill each other, one by one, until finally, after much time and throat-slitting later, only two remain. Obviously, Josephus and one other survivor. And he writes at that moment, they both looked at each other and they decided, perhaps enough people have died and we'll just surrender. Convenient. Suspiciously convenient. Anyway, whether by luck or by the will of God, our historian is alive and he can later write his book on these events and help make this podcast possible today. In his later writings, Josephus also claims something very dramatic, that God had revealed himself to him in his dreams and that he knew he had a divine mission, that he had been spared at that cave for a purpose, to deliver a message. And so Josephus is brought before Vespasian, alive. Now, many of the Romans call for Josephus to be executed. You know, having just directed the resistance that caused the deaths of thousands of Romans, or thousands of casualties at least, not to mention the weeks of hard work and toil that they had to bear to take this city. But it appears to others they admired his courage in the defence and wanted to spare him. I think what you want about Josephus and what happened in that cave, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in that cave, by the way. But his defence of Jotapata was commendable, and it's difficult to call him a coward at this point. Even Titus urges his father to spare him, apparently. And Josephus then asks Vespasian if he can speak with him alone, privately. And Josephus, he says something to Vespasian like follows. You think you have captured me by chance, but I come to you as a divine messenger from God. Will you send me to Nero? Why? Are his successors still alive? You, Vespasian, you will be Caesar. You will be emperor. And this son beside you will rule after you. Now, this claim doesn't come entirely out of nowhere. For years, there'd been a belief spreading through Judea that a man from their country would rise to rule the world one day. Many Jews believed that the prophecy referred to themselves, obviously. And at this time, during the uprising, many probably believed that this one was already amongst them. The historian Tacitus later wrote that many were convinced that this man from Judea would come to rule the world. But Josephus offers a different interpretation, that the prophecy did not point to a Jewish king or Jew at all, but the Roman general standing before him. Now, Josephus says that Vespasian dismissed his claim at first, but even if he didn't believe it, and had never even dared dream of becoming emperor, perhaps the idea now lingered, and a seed had been planted. And Nero still ruled the empire. Everything seemed pretty solid. Boudicca's rebellion in Britannia was put down a decade earlier, and Vespasian was himself now putting down the Jewish revolt. But under the surface, things were festering and beginning to crack. Now, Nero is a man that many of you will be familiar, if you're fans of Roman history like me, and who frankly deserves his own episode one day. Well, he's been ruling more and more like a despot, and a psychotic one. And although Vespasian couldn't know it yet, Nero's luck was about to run out. And the Roman Empire was about to hit one of the most turbulent times of this era. Within a year, Nero would be dead. Civil war would erupt across the empire, and the Roman world would be plunged into what historians would later call the Year of the Four Emperors. And this private conversation between this captured rebel and a Roman general in a tent outside this destroyed city in Judea, well, that may have been the first moment that Vespasian even entertained the idea, and perhaps the seed of destiny began to take root in Vespasian's mind. After the fall of Jotapata, the war continues, the Roman army slowly but surely advancing across the land. Some cities resist and are taken by force. Others, seeing the legions or hearing what happened to Jotapata, chose a different course. And at some point, Vespasian even rests his army up briefly in the lands of King Agrippa. Some rest for his troops and time to train before they make the big push towards Jerusalem. And meanwhile, amongst the Judeans, new figures begin to emerge. New leaders. Now, remember how fractured Jerusalem had become? After they drove the Romans out, all these different factions and leaders appearing, different visions of how the revolt should be handled, and the future of the country. But they had this provisional government in place, which is fair enough, but in reality, in the countryside, it was becoming a bit of a Wild West. Now you had these various rebel groups, some friendly, many not, bandits, others just banding together for protection, and many just doing it for opportunity and taking advantage of the lawlessness of the country. And basically, law and order is breaking down. And throughout history, there's a theme when this happens, when order collapses and power is suddenly up for grabs. And when this happens, it's not the cautious, the moderates, the good-intentioned that rise to the top. More often than not, it's the ruthless, the men willing to take huge risks. What's that saying? Hard times breed hard men. Men willing to bend the rules, manipulate others to their cause, and seize opportunity when others hesitate. Now, this actually interests me because it's applicable for modern times also. I'm sure we've all had a boss who's been a bit of a psychopath or a narcissist. There's actually been studies in modern times, and in psychology there's even a term for it, for a certain group of personality traits that thrive in competitive environments like the one we're talking about. And they call this trait the dark triad. Traits like narcissism, Machiavellian manipulation, where the person can be very deceitful to gain advantage, and psychopathy, which gives lack of empathy and the ability to make ruthless decisions without hesitation. There's even one study where, say, for example, 1% of the normal population may have the psychopathic trait to some degree. But if you go up the corporate ladder, or say Wall Street or somewhere, well, it rises to something like 20%. They're just more likely to rise to the top. Now, we can't apply modern psychology to people who lived 2,000 years ago, who we only have one account of, by the way, Josephus's. But one thing is clear, as the legions start closing in, there's several men that start to appear in Judea who could certainly fit the profile. And one of them is John of Giscala. Josephus describes John as capable, cunning, and extremely shrewd. A man capable of disguising his character. Ambitious. Josephus describes as quick to hope for great things, and extremely skilled at bringing those hopes about. John of Giscala came from a town called, Giscala, a town in northern Galilee. Most of the inhabitants were farmers, people who preferred peace so that they could cultivate their land. But among them, they'd started to form this dangerous group, a band of men now led by this John. Men accustomed to violence, making the most out of the rebellion for personal gain. Robbers, brigands, that sort of thing. Now, in fairness, all the descriptions of John are based off Josephus' writings. And Josephus, he's clearly not a fan of John. And above all else, Josephus claims that John encouraged the rebellion, not out of principle, but because it offered him what he desired above all else, power. In my movie, John's character would be played by Gary Oldman, the dark kind of role. If you've ever seen The Book of Eli, Gary Oldman, he plays this corrupt warlord figure ruling this ruined town with a gang of bandits. That sort of character. At this point of the campaign, Galilee's already been largely subdued. And when Titus approaches Giscala with a force of cavalry, he realises that it's a town that could be easily taken, but with much slaughter that can possibly be avoided. So Titus offers terms. So, why resist? Other cities far better fortified than this have fallen. Like, surrender now and live. What's the point in fighting and dying? So the inhabitants of Giscala, they were probably ready to accept the terms, but they aren't able to even reply. Because up on the walls, well, it's lined with John and his band of fighters and rebels who've effectively taken control of the town. So John, well, he has no intention of surrendering. It would mean the end of his power, perhaps even his death. And he's not about to give that up. No way. He's only just beginning. And Titus arriving might just have been the push that he needed to go on to an even bigger opportunity. So John devises a trick. He says to Titus, yeah, I'm willing to negotiate. The problem is, it's a Sabbath day, and we can't work or conduct business on a Sabbath day, even negotiations. Give us one more day. What do you think's going to happen in the meantime? You think we're going to run away overnight? Build a camp around the town if you want, if you're so paranoid. Well, Titus agrees, and that night, when John sees that there is no camp around the town, he makes his escape. But it's not a laughing matter. Unfortunately, John doesn't take away just his group of fighters, but a large portion of the civilians as well, many being women and children. Now, it's not quite clear if they were forced, but if John was as manipulated and cunning as Josephus would have us believe, then it certainly wouldn't have been out of character for him to risk all their lives for his own gain. But anyway, what happens next is quite heart-wrenching. After only a few miles outside of town, John abandons many of them. He pushes on to Jerusalem with his men, leaving the others strung out for miles. And in the morning, when Titus returns, well, the population of the city, they open up the gates, they welcome him in with joy, and they explain to him what's happened, that John has escaped. Well, Titus, furious, sends his cavalry out in immediate pursuit to capture this John. But by now, he's too far along the road, and the cavalry instead fall upon the civilians left behind, many of the women and children now out in the open. And Josephus tells us that 6,000 of them were slaughtered and 3,000 captured. And John, the man who tricked Titus, well, he's well on his way to Jerusalem, where his arrival would have consequences far greater than anyone could ever imagine. Josephus even writes of John's escape. This was the work of God, who therefore preserved John, that he might bring on the destruction of Jerusalem. But John of Giscala isn't the only leader emerging in Judea. While John is hurrying along to Jerusalem, we have another figure rising in the countryside. And his name we've heard before. He's Simon Bar-Giora. And he's a figure who played an important role in the defeat of Cestius during the fighting around Jerusalem. Josephus describes Simon as a very different type of leader to John. Whereas John was cunning, calculating, political, Simon, on the other hand, appears to be someone more blunt, a force of nature, a man of great physical strength, imposing, bold, aggressive, and fearless. Someone who commands loyalty by fear. If John is played by Gary Oldman in our movie, then Simon might be played by a David Bautista. Bigger than life character. After the early revolt and the defeat of Cestius, Simon, well, he'd been expelled from Jerusalem by Ananus, the new high priest, and the moderates. Returning to the countryside, he became a kind of bandit, warlord figure. Simon gathered around him a band of loyal fighters, a mix of rebels, outlaws, lower classes, even freed slaves. It almost gives the feeling that he's leading a kind of movement, like a populist uprising. It gives some small Spartacus or dark Robin Hood vibes, to be honest. But don't let that fool you. He's probably none of those people. He's not the people's champion. Probably far from it. More cold-blooded killer bent on his own power. Now he ravages and plunders the country. Not just the wealthy elite, by the way. Living off the land, slowly absorbing more and more, and longer the war goes on, the bigger his shadow becomes. And Simon will come back into the story later at the head of a much bigger army. But for now, we'll return to Jerusalem, because this is where John of Giscala is just headed, and he's about to stir up a whole lot of trouble. We're probably just under a year on, perhaps 10 months after the initial defeat of the Roman army under Cestius. We mentioned previously about the factional infighting. You know, there's a common theme in revolts and revolutions. Once the immediate enemy, government, monarchy, whatever it is overthrown, you've often got this splinter, internal squabbling, often civil war erupting, and quite often some of the main figures and leaders of the initial uprising, well, they lose their heads too, or their status. Look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. It's like opening up a Pandora's box. There's no putting things back. Events just have to take their course, all too often leading to far more bloodshed than anyone originally anticipated, and more bloodshed than what even caused the revolt in the first place. Inside Jerusalem, there's still some who believe that the revolt has gone too far, who feared the response of Rome, who feared for the very survival of their city, of their people. Others hope for negotiation, and while the Romans had been on the offensive all this time, these divisions were still there. Josephus writes how the country was full of robbers, and that these, along with refugees or others wishing to help the city fight, well, they all find the gates open to them. There's no vetting process. So by the time John arrives, the city's a tinderbox, already full of different various groups of armed men. And Josephus, he tells us that John immediately begins to stir up the crowd, boasting that the Romans struggle to even take a few small towns. Josephus writes of John addressing the crowds, as if these Romans, even if they were to grow themselves wings, could never fly over the walls of Jerusalem. How many of the younger men are taken in by him and begin to believe that the war can be won. Now, from episode 1, you recall the zealots who stopped the temple offerings and murdered the Roman garrison when they surrendered. Well, Josephus describes how they'd seized the temple and were causing a lot of miseries on the population at this stage. He even describes these zealots as robbers. Again, this is Josephus talking, and he's not a fan of Eleazar and the zealots either. Now, if you take his word for it, and then also factor in these bands of newcomers, robbers, bandits coming in from the countryside, criminals who come into the city, well, they soon start to become a scourge. And there's little anybody seems to be able to do to stop them. And they went about their robbing, even seizing some of the wealthier citizens, imprisoning them, murdering them. And as with revolutions, their justifications were simple: alignment with the old regime. These men wanted to negotiate with the Romans, therefore they're traitors, that sort of thing. But there are still the moderates, among them being Ananus, the high priest. Now he starts to speak openly against these violent factions that were starting to dominate the streets, basically telling everybody what most of them are already thinking, but now rallying them to take action, to rise up and take back control of their city. The focus of his attention appears to be the zealots in the temple. Ananus says how the temple has become infested with these tyrants, these abominations. He even starts to consider how these zealots are far worse than the Romans. And Josephus quotes Ananus' speech to the citizens, which goes as follows: "Perhaps you wait for the Romans, that they may protect our holy places. Are our matters then brought to that pass? Are we come to that degree of misery, that our enemies themselves are expected to pity us? O wretched creatures, will you not rise up and turn upon those that strike you?" He continues, "However, since I have had the occasion to mention the Romans, I will not conceal a thing, as I am speaking, comes into my mind, and affects me considerably. It is this, that though we should be taken by the Romans, God forbid the event should be so, yet can we undergo nothing that will be harder to be borne than what these men have brought upon us now? The high priest, he'd hit exactly the right tone, and he's rallied the crowd, and they start making preparations. Now remember, these zealots, who they are, these are the young fanatics, already committed to the path they've chosen, already fought the Romans. And most importantly, they know that if they lose power, a lot of revenge is going to be taken out on them for any distress they've caused to the city up until now. And they're well armed. They kind of remind me, reading about them, of the series Game of Thrones, when you have the High Sparrow and his followers, I believe are called the Little Sparrows. But they're really violent. They're young men, these religious fanatics, zealots, and they're anti-establishment, anti-elite. They want to purge any of the old system, anybody that disagrees with them. And they're violent. They can be very violent in their means and will take up arms. So they kind of remind me of that. And these zealots, hearing of what's happening, they find out before the citizens have organised themselves. Well, they're not going to give them the chance. So they burst out of the temple and they let themselves loose on the city on a murderous spree. The high priest and his followers, not being so well armed, or many resort to throwing stones or bare fists. But eventually javelins are being thrown, there's brutal hand-to-hand fighting, swords, whatever weapons people manage to get a hold of. Crowds running through the streets, back and forth, sometimes gaining momentum, and then there's a slaughter, sometimes the other side. And Josephus writes of heavy casualties, but by the sheer number of the crowds, they slowly begin to gain momentum. And soon it gives way to the zealots retreating all the way back into the inner courts of the temple walls. And this is where the high priest hesitates. We talked about good men hesitating and others not. Well, this is one of those moments. This high priest, who has a conscience, he doesn't want to attack the holy place, the most holy place for the Jews on earth. So he stations thousands of armed men around the temple as guards against these zealots. A big what-if moment. And this is where the moderates will throw away their last chance of keeping control of the city. Now, remember, the temple sits on a complex called the Temple Mount, which is this huge raised platform, basically like a mountain towering within the city. And on the outer wall of the temple, you have they call cloisters, basically pillared, covered walkways. And inside this court, you had then another small set of cloisters or wall, which is where the temple itself sits, and that's where the zealots are. They're cut off, but they're occupying the house of God. And for the religious, for the high priest, people like Ananias, well, they can't attack it. And it presents quite a big dilemma. But from the sidelines, there's been somebody else watching over these events very closely, and that's John of Giscala. As we've seen, he's a very clever and ambitious man. Well, he could see which way the wind was blowing, and outwardly he appears to support the moderates. He attends meetings with them, he goes out for walks with them, he even goes and inspects the guards, and people start to think, oh, hey, this John, he's an alright guy, seems like a good stand-up fella. But he tries a little too hard. He's a little too nice, a little too helpful, and the high priest and some of them start to become a bit suspicious of him about what his motives are. Maybe he's been a bit disingenuous. But the thing is, John has become so influential at this point that many of the eminent men now support him. And they say, hey, no, good old John, he's fine. You know, if you're suspicious of him, then have him swear an oath. John takes the oath without hesitation, of course. He swears to be supportive, to support the people, that he'll never betray them. And he's convincing. He becomes fully admitted into the council. back to our problem with the zealots shut up in the temple and wanted to avoid bloodshed, well, the high priest has little option but to start negotiations. So they need to send somebody in to pass on their message to the zealots about negotiating a peaceful surrender. And the man they choose to deliver such an important message? John. And John, as it turns out, well, he's been feeding the zealots with secrets all along, and probably a lot of disinformation as well. And the message he delivers is not the one from the high priest at all. Instead, he tells the zealots that they're in terrible danger, that the high priest and his followers are secretly planning to betray the city to the Romans, that even now, ambassadors are already on their way to Vespasian to invite him into the city. You see, John, he's playing chess, not checkers, and he has a solution already. He already knows that the zealots, what their thought process is going to be. The zealots won't have any mercy from within inside the city, especially if the Romans come, which he has them believe. They have no friends, not inside the city. They'll need to call somebody from outside. And John's cunning has worked, because at that moment they begin planning to bring another force into the city, and a lot more chaos would follow. Exactly the kind of chaos that John of Giscala thrives on. Now, what happens next? This will break the moderates for good. So the zealots, they send word to the Idumeans. Now, the Idumeans, they come from the south, the southern regions of Judea, having a reputation as fierce fighters and a strong hatred for Rome. So they've got something in common with the zealots there. Now, messengers are secretly sent south with a warning. Jerusalem, they say, is about to be betrayed. Ananus, the city leaders, well, they're preparing to surrender the city to the Romans, and only outside intervention can save the revolt. And the message works. The Idumeans, quick to come to arms, they start marching with 20,000 fighters towards Jerusalem. And when they arrive, they found the gates shut. So you see, this only reinforces the narrative that the city is about to be betrayed by the moderates to the Romans. Otherwise, why would they just not let their fellow countrymen in? They must be preparing to surrender the city to the Romans. So up on the city walls, you've got Annas, the high priest, and some of the other influential figures from the moderates. And one of the priests calls down to this group, basically attempts to explain the situation, referring to the zealots. And he says, look, you know, these guys, they've been doing all sorts in this city. They deserve death for what they've been up to, the scumbaggery, the villainy. He said, we've got the absolute dregs and the filth of the country in here. And these are the people that you're coming to help. Now, this is why we're not letting you in. We need to have trials for these people. They've been plundering the countryside, the city. They're a plague. They're robbers. They're wicked. So, yeah, they try their best to explain, but the Idumeans, they're not buying it. They believe the city's being sold out, and also the uprising, the revolt. You know, if Rome are let into the city, this will be the end of it. So the Idumeans, they make camp outside the city. There's a tense standoff, but they won't let them in, and the stalemate's there, but it doesn't last long. So that night, the same night the Idumeans set up camp, a violent storm strikes the city. And the Idumeans, they're wondering, have they made a mistake? This is a bad omen. Maybe God's angry at them for taking up arms against this holy city. But this thought quickly disappears, because during the violence and the distraction of the storm, the zealots make their move. Working in the darkness and noise of the storm, they manage to saw their way through one of the outer gates at the temple complex, unheard, with all the thunder, the noise. And as fate would have it, they make their way all the way to the city outer gate, and they open it. And the Idumeans, they flood into the city to the sound of thunder and rain. And initially there's a lot of confusion. They don't know if they're walking into a trap. Who's opened the gate? It's in the middle of the night. But they quickly realise who's opened the gate for them. And they rush to the temple to free the zealots that are trapped inside. And together with the zealots, they fall upon the guards. Some are cut down while they're sleeping, others awaken into the chaos, the noise, scrambling for their weapons, thinking they're fighting only the zealots. But when they see the men pouring into the temple complex, and the gravity of the situation dawns on them, their courage breaks. Many don their weapons, while some of the younger men fight on to the death. But amid the thunder and the pouring rain, a slaughter begins. You've got the thunder, the wind, the cries of the men, the clash of weapons, everything blending together. And the Idumeans, whipped up into a frenzy, they don't stop at the temple. Together with the zealots, they spread out into the rest of the city. Josephus writes, "But the rage of the Idumeans was not satisfied by these slaughters, but they now betook themselves to the city, and plundered every house, and slew everyone they met." Josephus claims that by morning, 8,500 bodies lay dead, and that was in the outer temple courts alone. That's not accounting for the rest of the city. Now, many died simply for being in the wrong place, caught in the path of these enraged Idumeans and the zealots, but others were hunted, targeted. Ananus, the high priest, other priests, important leading figures of the city, especially of the moderates of their camp, and they're cut down, their bodies left in the streets, not even buried, just treated with shock and contempt, really. And after this night, the violence only begins to get worse. The people, the citizens living in absolute terror. And Josephus tells us, "And the terror that was upon the people was so great that no one had the courage enough even to openly weep for the dead man that was related to him, or to bury him. But those that were shut up in their houses could only shed tears in secret, and thus not even groan without great caution, lest any of their enemies should hear them. For if they did, those that mourned for others soon underwent the same death those that they mourned for. Only in the night time they could take up a little dust and throw it upon their bodies." So thousands are killed. Families couldn't even mourn. And with this, the political landscape has changed completely. Now the moderate camp is destroyed, or at least their leaders are now gone. And no one with any sense would now dare stand up to the zealots and the other radical groups. And at this point, we can probably say that any chance of a negotiated peace with Rome is definitely gone. That ship sailed. And speaking of Rome, back to Vespasian. Well, him and his armies, they've still been marching, advancing methodically. Some more cities have fallen in the meantime. But while Vespasian slowly tightened his grip on Judea, far away back in Rome, Nero was starting to lose his grip on the empire. Without going into too much detail, his number was up. He became deeply unpopular. More importantly, he lost too much loyalty. And this time, the revolt didn't even begin with a conquered people, but a Roman governor. And this revolt didn't remain isolated, and Nero lost control of the situation very quickly. In June 68 AD, Nero flees Rome, and shortly thereafter he takes his own life. And with that, a bloody civil war begins in what would become known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, then Otto, Vitellius, and eventually Vespasian. And that strange moment when a rebel dragged from a cave stood before a Roman general and told him that he would rule the world, well, now it didn't seem so impossible. Nero's gone. And with the empire in turmoil, and Vespasian's gaze beginning to turn west, could this military machine be stopped? Would the legions turn back? And while Rome drifts into civil war, Jerusalem was already there. But almost as suddenly as they arrived, a good part of the Idumeans begin to leave. Josephus tells us that many of them came to realise that they'd been misled, having come to save a city, but then actually joining in and helping to destroy it, and many of them leave in shame. And into that vacuum, John of Giscala begins to rise further still. The man who had lied, manipulated, eliminated rivals, the man who caused all this recent turmoil in the city. He's not alone, he's not unchallenged, but he's rising higher and higher. And with the moderates gone, and the city descending further into chaos, Jerusalem is now running out of options. But there's still one last throw at the dice. A man in the countryside, a force of nature, growing stronger, gathering more followers, gathering an army. Simon Bar Giora. And in desperate times, desperate choices have to be made. And the people of Jerusalem, well, they'll call upon him before long. And that wraps up episode 2 of the 3-part series, Ashes of Zion. Thanks for joining my podcast, History's Darkest Hours. Please join us at episode 3, which is the final for this series. And we find out the fate of Jerusalem and our characters. Please, if you like the show, do subscribe, do share it with your friends. By the way, we've also created a Patreon group for this. We've got some more Roman content in the pipeline, but also some non-Roman content, Mongol invasions of Japan, and I've got other various ideas, and perhaps you can help give me some more. Either way, whether you join Patreon or not, thank you for listening, and please do join us again for our next episode. See you soon.